Alright, hello again. This is Philip at thebest3d.com with Project Dogwaffle and PD Howler 11 in this case here. But what I'm going to show is something you can do probably also with version 10 and I think even 9.6. I'm not sure if everything is there. For instance, right now here, again, this tutorial is focused on how to create elements for trees that have a large amount of bark, perhaps some lighting, shading, something like this here that you see here, and in the end you might want to paint a whole forest full of them. And you notice how I can, if I erase this, let's go erase it to white, how I can set it up so it's actually scaling automatically also. So I can draw a whole row of small trees far away, and as I draw down, it's going to get bigger and bigger. And that is done with the feature that you see down here in my sidebar, which I moved to the right side, but you probably have it on the left side by default. In the sidebar below the layers where the info is, and then below that there's the grids. Right? So in the grids section there is the Z-scale guide. If you turn that off, then the tree will just be, or the brush, whatever the brush image contains, will not be affected by that. But if you turn it on, what controls the size of that brush is what's in the swap image. If you switch to the swap image here, the swap buffer, you can see I put a gradient there. So the gradient controls the size in such a way that when it's black, it's 0 size, and when it's white is full size. And so with that, you can have that automatic scaling. But let's go to the beginning of this, which is how to create that tree in the first place. Right? How to create something like this tree. And you do the same for even more additional roots, or for more big branches. And then you can populate it with extra leaves and foliage, from the foliage brushes or from other elements. So this entire tree started with a selection. Right, so it will eventually need the fill settings. What we'll do is we'll use the patterns to fill, and to fill it with a pattern that contains something like tree bark. We do have a few of those. Essentially, these get loaded into the brush image. So you can see if you have the paint tool enabled, you'll actually see that pattern. These are collections of patterns that are all seamless, tileable. And some of them are for rocks, some of them are for all sorts of different patterns, and there are some also for tree bark. There's one here, the stump edge, that's the edge of a portion of a tree stump. That may be the only one actually for trees, but it's a good starting point, and it'll give you ideas of images you might want to collect yourself, load into a brush, and then once you have them in a brush, how do you warp that into the shape of a tree, with some sort of a perspective look or some slant, lying to the side, that sort of things. So let's start with very beginning. I'm going to go with the selection tool, that's the lasso. Right, here's the lasso tool, lasso to alpha. So with that, you can, just to understand the concept, you can create a selection of some shape, and then you can fill it. So we'll go to the fill bucket tool here, the flood fill tool, and there's the fill settings. Right, and you can fill it in a couple of different ways, including gradients. Right, so if you want to look at gradients, you can select, for instance, this one here that goes, or this one here, that's sort of a sunset sky look. Actually, not sunset, more like a bluish sky. But you can have it horizontally filled, or you could have it circular gradient, or you could have, now here are some interesting ones, the warp horizontal. And that one will kind of adjust a little bit to the shape. And we do the same with these patterns. So that's really what we want to focus on. Let's go clear this. How to fill the pattern. And this is the pattern. You can click here to see it tiled and repeated. You can click here on patterns on this button to get the pattern dialog and select the pattern you want. And I'm going to go, there's an oak bark. That might be interesting too. Let's try that. Alright, and otherwise we'll go back to the tree stump we had earlier. So if I use just the pattern fill mode, and by default we should have this one here, the replace or default mode. If I click here, we'll just fill it in, but it's not warped into the shape of the tree. This doesn't look like a shape of a tree either, so maybe we should fix that first. Let's go, where's my my lasso tool? There it is. And so if I'm going with a tree shape something like this, the bottom part of the tree, and then perhaps with the shift key I can keep adding to that selection and perhaps do some extra roots there, right? Something like this. There. So let's say that's the shape of the bottom of the tree and some of the roots that are visible. And maybe I want to shift this around with the control key down. You can shift the alpha over, right? Left button, you drag this around while the control key is down. That's how you shift the alpha channel, and it will warp around if you go too far. You can also do other transforms to that selection. If you look here under the free transform the selection, or simply there's a adjust selection, there's transform selection, so you can scale it like this, you can rotate it. There's all sorts of things you can do to that selection. Alright, so this is the selection into which I want to warp this image. And if we just do the pattern fill instead, then let's go here, then that's not going to look too good, right? So let's go undo and warp fill. See what that looks like. Alright, so now we have a little bit more of a, it's sort of aligning to the edges. It's responding to what the shapes are there. And so that could be a bit more interesting looking. Right? Sometimes that's not the case. And sometimes this one, the warp fill both, is producing interesting results, but it has its limits, right? It's not always as perfect as we could imagine. But fill horizontal might be a good point to try. If you don't like to go click here all the time, one thing you can also do is use the Q key. There's a shortcut under the image for fill, and that's fill Q. That shortcut is really useful, because you might want to also change the default fill mode to something like multiply. That makes it a bit darker. I just hit Q, and then so it renders it again over that, and that way it's not limited to where it's already at the same color. That it basically ignores the current color. So I can do Q, Q, Q a few times, hit that, and it gets darker, maybe too dark at some point. I could use other styles to other modes, like screen mode, that will brighten it up again, and then perhaps multiply again. So play with that a little bit. I'm going to go to the other pattern. I liked the other better, so I'm going to go to, where's my original one here, the stump. Alright, and let's do that one. Clear, Q, there you go. So we have a nice tree bark lining up, and you see it takes on the shape of that tree to some extent. Now I'm going to do that twice. Q, there you go. So it's nice, not too dark, not too bright. Now I still like to add some shading to that. Let's say I'm going to have this in a scene where the sun is shining from the left side or from the right side. You pick one, and you want to add some shading accordingly. So one thing you could do is go to the filter, stylize, and before you do that, by the way, let's take a snapshot of this, right? So here, store image. So you have a snapshot you can get back to. This will store the RGB and also the alpha channel, the image, with it. And so there's a whole lot of things you can do with it, such as restore the alpha, or just the RGB parts, and work with some of that. But at any rate, what we have here is something we can add some more shading or lighting to with the filter in the stylize lighting tool. So with that, we can put the light source over here, and perhaps have it on the left side, or on the right side, whatever you think is going to be needed. And adjust also the color. Let's say if this is light that barely makes it through the treetops, it's probably going to be tinted a little bit on the greenish side if we have some green leaves mostly blocking that light. Right, so you might want to give it a little bit of a tint like so. You might want to bring it down closer and make it a little bit brighter or not, and then also adjust the height of that texture and show the original a little bit more, or just grayscale it to make it just a relief. I like the original color to show as well, and adjust the brightness, intensity. So you can work with that to get some of the lighting going, And then, oh, there's also the smoothness, right? Sometimes there's too much detail and noise in that texture, and so what you can do is you can make it smoother, and you get a very different pattern with that. All right, so let's say we have this, and we still want to make it a little bit lighter, but then also darker on the other. So this side here should be lit. Let's go OK that. This side should stay as it is, but then this side should get darker. Well, it's a paint program. You can go paint that, right? You can go to the airbrush, or there's a couple of other effects. I think burn or some others. And there's also plenty of brushes in the browse for media area here. So don't dismiss that. There's plenty of ways to darken it, to burn it, to, I don't know if grime might have some brushes that will suit the purpose. But I'm going to go the easy route here and simply grab, I'm going to just use the airbrush, one of the larger airbrushes like this. And you can see a preview here. Make sure you click this eye icon here to show an on-screen preview. And then you can reduce the opacity so it's not going dark too fast as you're painting over. And so I'm going to go paint on this side and just darken it a little bit, very lightly, right? And that way you can add a little bit of 3D depth to it simply by making this side darker. There you go. And so now we have a tree stump that is quite respectable, and we can go and pick it up as a custom brush. You select it as brush, and it's still very light opacity. Let's bring it full opacity. There it is. So now I can start painting it. You'll want to store that in the browse for media. Create a new category, perhaps. Make a folder and call it My Trees or something like that, and then save media in there. And let's see, yeah, and then so at this point, it's just a matter of working with the brush. And there's a number of tools in the brush menu you'll want to become familiar with, such as flip. To flip it horizontal, X, right? So you put one down here, and then you hit X, and you have it also on the other side. And so that way you can create a view pretty quickly. You can also store this brush, which is highly recommended, so you can work with it some more and easily make a small version down here, and then a a bigger version that will go hide it in front and that sort of things. So at this point it's just a matter of working with brushes the way we work with brushes. So including changing the hue, randomly adding some hue. What is it there in the settings, in the brush settings you have a random hue, so you can do a little bit of different tone to that. Perhaps add a little bit tone, a little bit more on the, let's see if I'm going to exaggerate it so you can see more of that. But let's see, hue saturation value, here's some more saturation. So now you see it has a little bit of a greenish tint, but they're not all going to keep the same greenish tint if on top of that we also give it some random saturation, and especially the random hue. So, well, it's all about the same in this case, but you might get some extra variations that way, and certainly you can change them right here, right? You can change the hue here and get a bit more of a reddish, and another hue value for a bit more of a bluish, cold. Almost looks like it's got some moss on there. One thing you notice also here as I'm painting, it's got this little white glow along the edges, and that's something you can also eliminate usually. And in this case, this is the anti-aliased zone, right? The transition where the tree disappeared and the white background appeared. So either you start with a darker background, so it's not so easily seen, but you can also do what we call pre-multiply correction. If you know what the color was, and it's one of those, either you have it still in the primary or secondary color, or you knew it was white, you can correct that. And so now we have eliminated that white glow, and that's really the brush you will want to keep, right? Or export or save and keep for future use. Alright, the last thing would be to have it automatically scale. I'm going to store this brush here temporarily. Store, again, this is not saving it on disk, this is only storing it in memory. But the last thing that I'd like to do is to to paint this in such a way that it automatically changes the size based on the distance, right? Because I might have something like this going here. I might have some grass with the particle brushes. I'm going to go pin this down, and let's go get rid of the fill settings. Here I'm going to go to batty grass, for instance, here, and draw some grass. And perhaps I'm going to make it a little bit smaller at first for the grass that's far away. Right, and then paint that, and then go a little bit bigger. So change the scale as it's getting closer. And then I'm going to go and make it humongous. And so now I have sort of a perspective view, and I'd like to have the tree far away. If I click this tree here and disable my particle brushes, I'd like to have the tree small back there and big up there, and I might want to just paint a few of those. So that's where you can have this Z scale automatically kick in, and I still have a gradient that sets that. So if I look at the gradient, you can see there it is. In fact, I can see the other image at the same time simply by blending the two together. This icon at the top here, where the preview of the brush and the paper texture is, there's also a preview of the current image. If I click that, it's going to show both in a blended way, and you can actually control that blending. Right click here, there's about 20 different blending modes, and what I'm going to do is simply redefine my gradient to roughly match this edge of the grass to this front part of the grass. So I'm going to go to the gradient tool, right click to make sure I have the linear gradient, and I'm going to go from here to here. The gradient I currently have is a different one, so I'm going to need to select my gradient that goes from black to white, like this one. How fast it goes from black to white, that's also something you might want to adjust, right? You could say, well, maybe I need to not do a linear transition, but maybe more something like this or something like this to accommodate for perspective correction or something like that. So play with that a little bit. There's also a smoothing tool. If it's too rough here, you can click and hold it and it'll smooth it. And so now I have a gradient that I can use perhaps to go from black to white like this. And at this point I'm going to go disable the blending of the two, so I see just the gradient. I'm going to go switch back to the main image, and so I know the swap image is now in the back. Right, that's what this toggle does here, it switches between the two. And you can see the preview here, the big icon in the upper right. That one will also show you which image you're looking at. Alright, so as I'm looking at this, I know I can select the brush and be in the paint tool, and as I'm hovering over this, the trees are going to get smaller and they're going to get bigger depending on where on that gradient I'm positioning myself. Alright, so now I have the scale a little bit off here. I should probably go a little bit bigger for this. So let's do that gradient one more time here. Let's go from here a little bit higher. Right? I don't want to go totally black, black in the upper area here. So something like this will probably suit our purpose a little bit better. Our needs. There you go. So we have the tree still visible here, and as we're painting, perhaps with a bigger step distance. There you go. So it's a little bit sparser. Right. So now you can have the tree, and it's automatically changing the hue, random hue. It's got the size. It's got everything happening pretty quickly, and getting out of control. But that's what we're looking for here. So anyway, so thanks for watching. Hopefully this will give you some ideas on how to build your own trees with some fancy bark, and do a variety of sophisticated trees that you can put into your artwork. Alright, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.